Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Prajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Prajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Prajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. This morning we're reading from Canto 11, Chapter 2, Text 44. Shri Rajavacha Ata Bhagavatam Brutam Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nirnam Yata Charati Yad Brutem Yar Lingar Bhagavat Priyam Shri Rajovacha Ata Bhagavatam Brutam Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nirnam Yata Charati Yad Brutem Yar Lingar Bhagavat Priyam Shri Rajovacha Ata Bhagavatam Brutam Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nirnam Yata Charati Yad Brutem Yar Lingar Bhagavat Priyam Shri Rajovacha Ata Bhagavatam Brutam Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nirnam Yata Charati Yad Brute Yar Lingar Bhagavat Priyam Shri Rajovacha Ata Bhagavatam Brutam Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nirnam Yata Charati Yad Brute Yar Lingar Bhagavat Priyam. And the word for word translation for text 44. Shri Raja Uvacha. The king spoke. Ata, next. Bhagavatam, about the devotee of the personality of Godhead. Bruta, please tell me. Yat Dharma, having what duties? Yadrisha, having what nature? Nirnam, among men. Yata, how? Acharati, he behaves. Yat, what? Brute, he speaks. Yai, by which. Lingai, visible symptoms. Bhagavat Priya, he's known as one dear to the Supreme Lord. And the translation for text 44, and this is a BBT translation, so the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. Maharaj Nimi said, now please tell me in greater detail about the devotees of the Supreme Lord. What are the natural symptoms by which I can distinguish between the most advanced devotees, those on the middle level, and those who are neophytes? What are the typical religious activities of a Vaishnava, and how does he speak? Specifically, please describe those symptoms and characteristics by which Vaishnavas become dear to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. and the BBT purport. The great sage Kavi has informed King Nimi about the general external symptoms of a devotee of the Lord, namely his appearance, personal qualities, and activities. But now King Nimi asks how to make further distinctions among the servants of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so the first class, second class, and lower class Vaishnavas can be clearly identified. According to Srila Rupa Goswami, Krishneti Yasya Kiritan Tam Manasa Driyeta. One should mentally honor any devotee who chants the holy name of Lord Krishna. Upadeshamrita 5. Any living entity who is faithfully chanting the holy name of Krishna is to be considered a Vaishnava, and at least within the mind is to be offered respect. But for practical advancement in Krishna consciousness, one should associate at least with a second-class devotee. And if one can receive the mercy of a first-class devotee of the Lord, one's perfection is very easily guaranteed. Thus, Nimi Maharaj is humbly inquiring, quote, what are the character, behavior, and speech of devotees, close quote. The king wants to know the particular symptoms of body, mind, and speech by which the different categories, Uttama Adhikari, Majjhima Adhikari, and Kanishta Adhikari, are clearly identified. In response to the king's inquiry, another of the Nava-yogendras, namely Havi, will give further elaboration of the science of Krishna consciousness. Om Jnanatimmirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Tadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shruta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavam Shah Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahaganaragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagat Pate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute. Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radha Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye. Vanchakalpa Taribhyas Cha Kripa Sindhubhye Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Shrimataram Padaswami Iti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimata Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Sunyavadi Pashaja Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So I'll read the question raised or the translation to the particular verse. Maharaj Nimi said, now please tell me in greater detail about the devotees of the Supreme Lord. What are the natural symptoms by which I can distinguish between the most advanced devotees, those on the middle level, and those who are neophytes? What are the typical religious activities of a Vaishnava, and how does he speak? Specifically, please describe those symptoms and characteristics by which Vaishnavas become dear to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he notes that the previous text, text 42, mentioned the devotees. So that verse was this one. O King, the devotee who worships the lotus feet of the infallible Lord with constant endeavor achieves unflinching devotion, detachment, and experience of the Lord. He achieves supreme happiness. So that was the previous text which described devotees. And now King Nimi asks about the qualities of the devotees. What is their nature, meaning dharma? The word that was used was yadrisha, their nature. Srila Vishwanath notes that this is a question about their mental condition. So, in looking at this, particularly this insight on the part of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, one can say that the qualities of the devotees were in fact already described by Kavi earlier on in text 43. So he's the first of the 9 Yogendras who's been speaking up to now and answering Maharaj Nimi's first question. Today is the beginning of a new question. So it's a new question that Maharaj Nimi is proposing. And this time the new question is being proposed by Havir, so the second of the Yogendras. So, since I mentioned that the qualities of the devotee, because that is the question being brought up by King Nimi, this new question, they were already described by Kavi. So I'm going to read that particular description of the qualities of the devotee that Kavi describes. So this is how he described it. That intelligent person who has controlled his mind and conquered fear should give up all attachment to material objects such as wife, family, and nation, and should wander freely without embarrassment, hearing and chanting the holy names of the Lord, the bearer of the chariot wheel. So that was in the 39th text of this chapter. So it's giving some description of the qualities of a devotee. Notice intelligence, has controlled his mind, and conquered fear. And of course, he's also giving some advice that that person needs to give up all attachment to material objects. So the feature or attribute which makes a devotee is his or her having given up material sense gratification. So the reason for one not indulging in gratifying one's senses on a material level is that one would perpetuate the concept of being one's body. If one's just trying to please the senses, then it perpetuates that concept, the concept one holds of oneself. So if that is the concept one holds of oneself, then one will undoubtedly, and this you may have experience of, one will undoubtedly see the pastimes of the Lord from a materialistic point of view. It's very difficult to actually see the pastimes correctly if one's holding that kind of concept of oneself, just seeing oneself very much or identifying oneself very much with one's senses and one's body. So pastimes that come from a bodily need or having some bodily satisfaction, rather than that this is how the person would be seen holding a bodily concept of themselves, they're going to see those pastimes as coming from some bodily need on the part of Lord Krishna, rather than that those pastimes have a spiritual or an intellectual value. They're not going to see that. So the second distinguishing attribute of a devotee, so the first one was, having pushed aside any trying to gratify the senses, and the second distinguishing attribute of a devotee is that he or she is accepting the Lord as he presents himself in Bhagavad Gita. So that quality of a devotee is described by Lord Krishna, this one of accepting Lord Krishna as he's presenting himself. And this is the understanding the devotee holds. So Lord Krishna describes what understanding the devotee holds. When one properly, this is Krishna talking, when one properly sees that in all activities no other performer is at work than these modes of nature, and he knows the Supreme Lord who is transcendental to all these modes, he attains my spiritual nature. So that's a description by Lord Krishna of what understanding the devotee is approaching anything. And that understanding is that the person who's actually performing work, he's not saying, oh, this is me doing this. Rather, he's taking a very objective standpoint. This is the understanding the devotee holds. Oh, the modes of nature are operating. I'm being forced to act in this particular way and in this particular way. So that's from Bhagavad Gita 14:19, where Krishna describes the understanding the devotee has. So the devotee can transcend, just by virtue of the fact that he says that the devotee knows me as the Supreme Lord. That's what's allowing the devotee to transcend the particular way of acting or doing or being. So being separate from his or her spiritual nature. And particularly, being able to transcend this way of acting or doing or being that's just really the modes of nature operating is by getting instruction from a spiritual master. Because this is the means. Just hearing that instruction, following that instruction, is the means for getting to know of one's spiritual position, one's understanding that one's material body, understanding more about one's material body, understanding more about one's senses, and understanding more about how one's influenced, or even you could say enchanted by a particular way of being or functioning or doing, be it in goodness, passion, or ignorance. So the two distinguishing qualities of a devotee, because that's answering Maharaj Nimi's second questions, because he's interested, what are these qualities of a devotee? So armed with these two qualities, namely, having pushed aside sense gratification and also accepting Krishna, how he's actually explaining himself in Bhagavad Gita. So armed with these two qualities, the devotee is defined by Kavi, because we're referencing that whole section where Kavi is looking at the qualities of a devotee. Defined by Kavi as one who controls his or her mind and also overcomes fear. So that's the consequence of having these two qualities that a devotee has. The definition is there that the devotee is one who controls his or her mind and also overcomes fear. So there's an interesting examination of the path for overcoming fear, and Bhakti-tirtha Maharaj looks at this very closely. So Bhakti-tirtha Maharaj, he draws attention to Lord Rishabdev, who explains what is the nature of the mind. So here's a description of the mind by Lord Rishabdev. It's from Srimad Bhagavatam, 5th canto, 6th chapter, 5th verse. The mind is the root cause of lust, anger, pride, greed, lamentation, illusion, and fear. Combined, these constitute bondage to fruitive activity. What learned man would put faith in the mind? So that's Lord Rishabdev, incarnation of Lord Krishna speaking. So if the mind is the cause of being trapped in material functioning, then the control of the mind requires engagement in Krishna consciousness. So, because remember, that's what's going to be separating one from material functioning and moving into a more spiritual position in relation to Lord Krishna. So due to negative circumstances, we may have undergone in the past something that allows us to maintain a sense of fear in the present. So there's a necessity to take shelter of spiritual culture, and this is the words used by Bhakti-tirtha Maharaj, repeatedly surcharge spiritually, because you're dealing with this mind, and because of something that you experienced in the past, because we're looking at fear, you may be carrying fear with you all the time. So hence the necessity repeatedly surcharge spiritually. Otherwise, the fear remains an integral part of one's life. So adhyatmika is the fear of attacks created by one's own mind. So you can be attacked by your own mind. You don't need an external anything to be attacking you. Your own mind's attacking you. And adhibodhika is the fear that results from our interactions with other people. And this is the words used by Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, the constant disappointments or disturbances we experience. So this is interacting with other people is described by Bhaktitirtha Maharaj as constant disappointments or disturbances. So this is coming from his writings from a spiritual warrior. So the mind is so powerful that whatever our regular thoughts, these clearly will affect our acting and our speaking. So if a lot of mental energy is put on a particular anxiety, for instance, because anxiety often accompanies fear, a mentality is created with an internal dialogue, so even causing our worst fears to manifest. So there's some fear in the mind, and we put a lot of mental energy into that fear. So you're feeding it. So there's a kind of internal dialogue that starts happening related to the fear. So it may even cause that fear to manifest because you're constantly so focused on it. So from my personal experience, it becomes necessary to place that thinking in writing so one can actually challenge that thinking, those thoughts, with rational reality. Because the mind isn't necessarily irrational. And especially if one's carrying fear from something that occurred in the past, some impressions from the past. So Narada sheds light on one's thoughts. This is how Narada puts it, because this is, again, referencing that conversation with King Prachinibari. So this is how Narada puts it, because he's shedding light on, these thoughts that one's carrying. My dear King Prachinibari, the living entity who has a subtle mental covering develops all kinds of thoughts and images because of his previous body. Take this from me as certain. There is no possibility of connecting anything mentally without having perceived it in a previous body. So that's Narada's view. So it's not even something that happened in this lifetime, but thoughts and connections that are there in the mind have come because one's perceived those things in a previous body. So that's Narada speaking to King Prachinibari. So Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he puts fear into 5 categories. So one is general anxiety, and general anxiety that you're carrying, so this is all being carried in the mind, the thoughts. It can actually have a physiological effect. So it can affect the heart or cause dizziness or trembling even. The second category Bhaktitirtha Maharaj has for fear is panic. And this has got symptoms such as headaches, nausea, sweating, vomiting. I have a friend who, from university, who lives in Paris, and that person does all kinds of directs many campaigns for different companies. So does the filming, you could say. I don't know what the correct word would be now, but filming different scenarios to promote different products, and a highly creative person, and that person suffers from panic. So every now the poor person gets hit with panic. So, and the third category for fear from Bhaktitirtha Maharaj is obsessive compulsive disorders. So these also manifest from fear. And an obsessive compulsive disorder is such that one is compelled to do the same activity over and over again. So the repetitive behavior may, for example, take the form that somebody in their mind is carrying a fear of disease. So to counteract such a possibility, that person may have the behavior of spending hours washing their hands. I remember having an aunt when I was very small, watching her spending ages just soaping up her hands and washing them and washing them. So I don't know what her fear was. I was too small to know. But this is an obsessive-compulsive kind of disorder. And then the fourth category of fear that Bhaktitirtha Maharaj identifies is a phobia. So a phobia is such that a person may live every day under the most heavy fear. For example, they're actually walking around constantly fearing heights. They may not be in a place that's high, but constantly that fear is in the mind. Or alternatively, they have this phobia of being in a very small contained space. And then the fifth category of fear that may be present in the mind, as identified by Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, is post-traumatic stress. So this results from previous trauma or hurt. For example, if a person was abused in some way. So Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he notes that fear allows Maya or evil to enter deep into a person's consciousness because it destroys the shield of love that eliminates the blocks or attack. So it may be so strong, the fear, that it's actually even blocking the person from being able to connect to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So he calls it actually breaking down the shield that would actually protect the person. So great is the fear. They're not even able to find shelter in a spiritual connection with Lord Krishna, and hence the love that would be there that would be shielding them from the fear. So great may be the fear. So those are the 5 categories that Bhaktitirtha Maharaj identifies, because we're looking at fear being held in the mind. So Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he looks at a post-traumatic stress also on the broader level in spiritual communities. So in the broader spiritual community, there may be many persons who have anxiety attacks and great fear due to experiences in the spiritual community. So there was one devotee who told me that she's not able to enter the temple without feeling huge tearfulness. And so she actually requested if I could please hold her hand when she comes into the temple room. So this is the result of having some anxiety attack or great fear because of some experience in the past within the institution. So I didn't ask her what her particular experience was, but that's a symptom of there having been such an experience. So Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he points out that it's difficult for anyone suffering from abuse or exploitation in any form, however it is. However, it is even worse when a person's life, or even their profession, say they were serving as a devotee, has been altered due to such atrocities. So again, I had some exposure to somebody having this kind of fear. Many years ago in the Tobacco Temple, there was a Bhakti Shastri course going on, and one of the devotees attending one day became aware that a visitor passing through was a person who had abused him sexually as a child. So that person passing through delivered a class, and the poor devotee attending the Bhakti Shastri course was in a state of complete anxiety. So that's some atrocity that was committed, but that devotee was still able to somehow be there, but going through extreme anxiety in the presence of a person who'd perpetrated a particular atrocity. So it's very devastating for those who've lost faith in the spiritual process. It may take that form. They're afraid to engage in spiritual practices even, or they may fear spiritual association. And of course, it's so unfortunate because that association or engagement in spiritual practice is exactly what would allow them to be on the path of self-realization, but they're now afraid to go on that path because of the fear that's present in the mind based on some kind of atrocity that was committed within the institution. So Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he gives techniques for such persons to help their minds. So one is, because there may be now a little distrust of the philosophy. So he suggests that one can scrutinize the philosophy to determine whether or not it is unhealthy. So you have to, it's again that idea that the mind is just carrying a fear and it's very extreme. So you have to actually measure it up against reality. You have to use the intellect. So hence, if you've got some uncertainty about the philosophy, then you actually have to use the intelligence and apply yourself and scrutinize the philosophy. Is it actually unhealthy? So it means that any deviation that one experienced through observing somebody else, it's not in the philosophy, it's just somebody's external deviation or them not following the philosophy. So then it can allow the person to move their attention to actually have the good experiences they had in the community. And there can also be a practice of forgiveness. I came across a very interesting article. There's a magazine, Spirituality and Health, and there was an interview with someone, and the person was saying that actually it's a very good practice to verbalize forgiving somebody. So one can say, I forgive X person for having done X, Y, Z, and actually saying it to oneself, because it helps the mind. It helps the mind go past fear, because then you're taking charge by saying, I forgive that person for X, Y, Z thing that was perpetrated. So this is one of the ways of managing the fear that Bhaktitirtha Maharaj brings up, practicing forgiveness. And it also allows one to be in the present. And the past doesn't constantly haunt one if one has actually taken charge that way. Of course, it requires having actually gone through a closer examination of what happened and understood that the behavior, and this is me speaking, the behavior of somebody else belongs to that person. One doesn't have to now carry that atrocious behavior with one. That behavior truly belonged to the other person. It's got nothing to do with one. So therefore, if one has actually managed to work through that and understand that the behavior belongs to that person, then it becomes much easier to say, oh, I forgive that person for having done that behavior in relation to myself. Another method that Bhaktitirtha Maharaj gives for dealing with this fear that may be present in the mind is to allow for a kind of cognitive reconditioning. So there's behavioral psychology, which there's the understanding that the mind has got conditioned, means you've learned certain patterns. So there's a classic example of, in behavioral psychology, of Pavlov running experiments with dogs where, you ring a bell and the dog comes to know that when the bell is rung, that's when food will arrive. So then, even if food were not to arrive, just hearing the bell causes the dog to start salivating. So the mind has learned the pattern. Bell, ring, sound of bell equals food coming. So that's even in the case of an animal. So what to speak of persons, there's a learned behavior. So somebody may have acquired a certain fear, that emotion, because it's connected to a particular incident in a particular environment. So the technique would be cognitive reconditioning, and Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, he puts it this way. If the abuse happened in a religious setting, for example, then for a period of time, one should actually do one's worship in a non-threatening situation. So, praying and asking Lord Krishna to allow one to gain a different perspective. It's necessary to seek that kind of help because you're dealing with a mind that's now got this heavy impression and one's carrying that emotion of fear or anxiety. Alternatively, one can visualize oneself in that environment where the fear happened, but seeing oneself doing well. So this is a kind of a reconditioning that is necessary to come to terms with the fear and to minimize its effect on one. So Srila Vishwanath, so going back to Srila Vishwanath, since I've looked at, because this is one of the questions raised by King Nimi. He wants to know about the qualities of the devotee and something, and Srila Vishwanath analyzed it, that it's also looking at their mental conditions. So I've tried to look at the mental condition, particularly in relation to fear and anxiety. So Srila Vishwanath, he asks the question, and he's rephrasing what King Nimi is wanting to know. What types of devotees are there? That's what he wants to know. That's the verse today. So this is a question about the different grades of devotees that can be there. And he wants to know, what is their conduct? How do they conduct themselves? So Srila Vishwanath says this is a question about bodily conduct. So, of course, the next 3 verses will completely answer this question. So I'm not going to go into that because there is that. I'm just looking at these questions that are being raised and the significance of them. So Havir, the second of the 9 Yogendras, will come to answer those different grades of devotees in the next 3 verses of this Srimad Bhagavatam chapter. But in looking from this verse today, where the question has just been asked, Lord Krishna gives a breakdown of those who become eligible for elevation of consciousness. So those that become eligible to have their consciousness elevated to a transcendental position. So this is how Krishna breaks it down. Persons, this is him speaking, persons who have acted piously in previous lives and in this life, and whose sinful actions are completely eradicated, are freed from the dualities of delusion, and they engage themselves in my service with determination. So that particular verse, because it's so significant to our discussion, Bhagavad Gita 7:29, Yesam tvanta gatam papam janam punya karmanam te dvandva moha nirmukta bhajante mam tridha vrata. So the bodily conduct that Maharaj Nimi is very interested in and is such that these persons that become eligible for elevation of their consciousness, they've actually practiced the regulative principles of religious life and they've acted piously. So because of doing that, they've conquered the reactions that come from any sinful activities that have been performed. And so they're able to accept devotional service and gradually rise to knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So gradually, such persons can meditate in trance on the Lord, because it's a gradual process, being able to meditate on Lord Krishna, taking into account their receptiveness to start off with. So this is the process of becoming situated on the spiritual platform. And this elevation that is possible, it's through the association of pure devotees. It's absolutely essential. It means that persons in this way can be delivered from any delusion, because that's what the mind is carrying. It was described earlier on. It's actually carrying all these unfortunate things, and one of them is delusion. So another aspect of their conduct is that there's strong faith that by Krishna consciousness, one will be elevated to the highest perfection of life. So not only is there that initial receptivity because of having adhered to religious principles and acted piously, But another part of their conduct, because this is what Maharaj Nimi wants to know about devotees, is that there's a strong faith that by Krishna consciousness, one will be elevated to the highest perfection of life. And how this can be identified, that there is this, this kind of strong faith, is you see that there's a single pointed kind of intelligence that's been utilized. So their conduct is such that they need not act in relation to the material world with obligations to family traditions or humanity or nationality. Rather, the conduct is such that the devotee no longer needs to try and achieve good results in his activities. This is the change that happens internally. So the reason this is so is that all activities are now on the absolute plane because of one's consciousness being different. So it means that one isn't being subject to that kind of dualistic judgment internally of, is this good or is it bad? Because that's generally what persons have to do. They constantly have to judge their actions. But now the devotee, because of shifting the intelligence, having that strong faith, that this faith in Lord Krishna is going to carry them through to the perfection of life, they're not caught up in that kind of dualistic judgment that goes on in the mind of, is it good or is it bad? So, in fact, by continuing in this kind of way, they're weakening that concept that's present in the mind of everything on a very material level. So in fact, what's happening is there's a renouncing of the material concept of life. So the devotee has knowledge that Krishna is the root of all. And by serving him, one is automatically rendering the highest service to everyone. Because it might sound odd when one says that the person no longer has those kind of obligations to humanity, society, family traditions. And it's in order, actually, because automatically one is rendering the highest service to everyone, oneself, one's family, one's society, one's humanity, etc., just by having the strong faith in the adherence to practicing Krishna consciousness. So that bodily conduct, because Maharaj Nimi is interested in this, is dependent on obeying the representative of Krishna. So all this internal change that happens, it really is dependent on obeying the representative of Krishna, accepting his instruction as one's mission in life. I was reflecting on this because in my case, it's been quite a few decades of practicing Krishna consciousness. And one of the instructions I received very early on in my going on the path of Krishna consciousness was to do children's education. So I took that as my mission, and it actually just flowed. I mean, decades passed, and I didn't even attend to, what am I doing, what am I not doing? It was just natural. One just flows, and taking it as one's mission. So in addition, the conduct, one's bodily conduct, going back to what Maharaj Nimi wants to know, it excludes gratifying the senses. So one's not focused on, how am I going to make myself happy by what I see or what I hear. It really becomes depending on having a concept of the self as the soul. That's where one actually shifts one's attention, as opposed to holding the concept of oneself being just the body. So it really is functioning on a completely different plane. So this was an attempt to look at this text where just a question has been raised. So I've tried to explore what is behind the question based on Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's breaking it down into looking at the mental condition of devotees. and also the particular internal functioning that's going on. And in the next 3 verses will be the greater breakdown of the classification of devotees into different categories. So I didn't go that route because the next 3 verses cover it. So if there's some question that comes or something that can help to expand the discussion, please feel free.
Thank you, Mata. I came a little late, but what was that book that Bhaktitirtha Swami you were referring to?
He's written, I think it's 5 separate books called The Spiritual Warrior.
Oh yeah, I've seen those.
Yes, so I was referencing one of those.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I think I was referencing the first one where he's particularly looking at fear being held in the mind and anxiety being held in the mind.
I remember Srila Prabhupada saying the problem with you, he was saying, I think he was saying Western people, his audience, he said you don't have a healthy fear of Maya. So that's a good fear to have, because if I do certain activities, there's going to be reactions. Did you ever look at it that way?
So the comment of Srila Prabhupada was that the Western audience doesn't have a healthy purifier.
Have a healthy fear of Maya. He said you don't have
View of Maya. View of Maya.
Fear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was hearing purifier, healthy purifier.
Oh.
Okay, view of Maya, healthy view of Maya.
Not
Yeah.
fear.
Fear of Maya. Sorry, I don't know why I'm not hearing well. Thank you.
Yeah.
So not having a healthy fear of Maya. Well, that's interesting because I guess the particular predisposition of the mind is to be entertaining Maya constantly, taking it as reality internally, that the illusion is one's reality. So that particular instruction of Srila Prabhupada is very, 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 very extraordinary when you think about it, because it's actually drawing attention to the fact that one is so comfortable with that illusory kind of reality. What's present in the mind is real.
Yes.
As opposed to seeing it that it's things that the mind is carrying, and often impressions and perceptions even from other lives. And it's just putting things together that way. And particularly the emotion that goes with those impressions is being carried so strongly in the mind. So one's taking fear as a reality, whereas from Srila Prabhupada's instruction, it would be that you need to understand it as something delusional or illusory. So you need to actually bring, rational spiritual intelligence to the matter and examine something.
To discriminate between, well, we say that material world is a network of illusions, and the senses are a pathwork of leading to death. That's in the Prasadam prayer. But another thing is, I think I mentioned it a long time ago, Prabhupada was fearless, fearless. But he was with the devotees, I think in Hawaii or Los Angeles, and I think it was maybe Hawaii, and he was walking along the beach with the devotees, and the devotees said, the deities look very beautiful, and everything's very beautiful today, Prabhupada. And he said, I believe he said, this is what I fear. When I leave, the standard will go down. Because when he was there, he was always pointing out, the shortcomings. But he was apprehensive about leaving, I think, because it would be mismanaged. Because it says in the scriptures that when a spiritual master leaves, when he arrives, chaos is put aside. But when he leaves, chaos returns. So that's why we, whenever there's a rise in irreligion and a decline in religious activity, at that time I descend to annihilate the miscreants and to deliver the pious. So there's like, have you heard that one before?
Thank you, Jitendra Prabhu. Yes, that's, I know, thank you for bringing it up, but it's, Srila Prabhupada can feel so encouraged, if encouraged is the right word, but happy that ISKCON has actually given so much attention to deity worship. So the deity worship manuals are very detailed and very perfect and very wonderful, and they are followed in all temples. So there is a guideline, you could say, the Pancharatrika Pradipa, 2 volumes, which actually puts everything very clear of what the behavior has to be and what the standards are. So that development of in written form of those standards is what allows everything to stay controlled. So just responding, one can say one is so happy that ISKCON has actually developed so positively to actually have these kind of written guidelines.
Yes.
And procedures.
Then everybody acts according to the nature in which he's acquired what good will repression accomplish. So, and Jayapataka Swami had a book, What Kind of Devotee Are You? Have you seen that book? Have you seen that book?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But I have not read.
Just a few things that have come to mind, when you're bringing these things up. But, and then, forgive, what they say, forgive but don't forget. But I remember the pastime of Krishna and Sisipal. He offended like 99 times, but on the 100th time he took his head off. So in the Krishna book, he deals with all these different bad qualities that people in certain ones represent this quality or that quality, like Kamsa, Hiranyakashipu, Hiranyaksha, but that was how the sequence is explaining all these bad qualities and how Krishna deals with them.
Thank you, Jitendra. Thank you. That's very wonderful that you brought that up. Yeah, in terms of repression of nature, I mean, just thinking of this examination by Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj in Spiritual Warrior on, atrocities being committed by persons within the institutional setting, then one can think that, some nature is not in order. So that is problematic when you actually get persons who have deviant behavior, or the nature impels them to act in some sort of way that is harmful to others and puts other persons in jeopardy of some bad experience. So, in those cases, it actually does require somebody being removed. So, calling in the legal system so that the nature isn't given space to act in a setting where it's just going to allow the person to practice their nefarious deeds. So just thinking about that.
Yeah, and the temples act as a reformatory, an insane asylum, and a place for devotional service. It's progressive, and I remember Romapat Swami saying, yes, life is progressive. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, talking of Sharampana Swami, I remember many years ago, he did say that there's some kind of persons with some kind of behavior that you cannot deal with, and then you actually have to hand it over to the legal system. So, one has to sometimes acknowledge it's not possible for that person to go through their reformatory process in the setting. Yeah.
Hare Krishna. Thank you
Hare
so
Krishna.
much for your very nice class. I was listening live.
Thank you
very
much.
interesting, points about the fear and what Bhakti Tirtha Swami said. I have one comment I remembered from the lecture of my Guru Maharaj and one question. So one comment was that about the fear. I remember he said that if you fear something, you said that it helps to write down or say it out loud. And I remember he was saying that you can write down what is the worst could happen if this, fear comes true or whatever you fear comes true. And then you look at it and see it's not like that bad. Actually helped me a lot to overcome my fears. And the question I have is, can you make some comments about the guilt? For example, if someone is planting for many years a guilt in the other person, and then you start believing that you're guilty and you cannot get rid of it.
Yes, that's a very relevant point to have brought up, that if in the mind now there's some guilt that has been created because of other persons dealing with one. And that was one of the points that Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj brought up, that generally dealing with others, interactions with others, leads to great disappointments and frustrations and unhappiness. So if the unhappiness has taken that form that a person has tried to shame one, and one's actually carrying around something that one has inferred by what they're communicating. So if a parent, because generally it's parents who do this, I remember watching a video where a little girl was being asked by her father, a young man, oh, so who were you phoning? Were you phoning your boyfriend? And the little girl was cringing and so embarrassed, and, because she could sense that the tone was, it's one of inducing guilt. So I was watching this video and I was just thinking that constant exposure to that kind of guilt-inducing, the little girl may not have been even thinking about, she was way too young. But that constant exposure to a parent trying to shame a child means that the child then starts to hold a certain concept of itself in the mind. So I am a person who is licentious. I am a person who has behavior that is excessive in terms of trying to attract the opposite sex. These could be inferences that the child could make over time. It carries through as a teenager, as a young adult, goes through life carrying those ideas because of the constant onslaught from the parent. So the dealing of guilt, I didn't look in Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj on that particular point, but just because of having, I guess, been trained in behavioral psychology, because that is my area of study, the first thing that comes to mind is, again, the thing that there's thoughts that one is carrying, so one needs to actually put those thoughts down on paper, because as a bad feeling is coming, some sort of feeling of shame, perhaps. So when one feels that feeling of shame, one writes down what it is that one is thinking. I am licentious. One writes it down. And then, because one knows that one wants to change this, and it may not yet be clear where this comes from, one actually has to look at when did I when do I remember feeling these feelings? So one does a kind of, oh, I remember my father used to say this to me. So you write it down, and then you have to do a contending thought, because you're applying your present strong self with your strong intelligence, where you're actually going to disagree and contend that particular thinking. So then one writes, I remember myself always being a very studious person. I'm, just bringing up something, whatever you understand of yourself. I remember myself being a very studious person. I had no interest in that kind of area that was being told to me that I had an interest in. So therefore, this is untrue. And then one doesn't try to analyze why the other person is behaving like that or saying those things, but rather always one actually reinforces one's own reality. And one can do this over and over again every time that shame comes. And it may take a long time because it's entrenched in the mind, because now a belief has been created. So you need to actually change that belief. So this method of actually using one's intellect and literally writing it down so you can see it, it's very powerful. It starts to erode that, and the reality starts to emerge that, oh, this behavior of shaming belongs to that person. It's got nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me whatsoever, because I don't see any of my behavior that actually correlates with that kind of interpretation of me. So you begin to understand it's somebody else's behavior, and you're carrying a belief that's got created because of another person's behavior, their verbalizations to you and what you understood from them. So you need to separate yourself from that. And that's done very well through writing. And so you put down the thought that causes shame, you look at it a little bit, and then you put something of your understanding of yourself, where you're actually fighting that thought. And it can take a long time, but it definitely works. It definitely works, because one comes to see that it does not belong to one. Thank you. So thank you very much for your very kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.